The heavy blast doors of the botanical bay hissed open with a mechanical sigh. The sound of regulation boots echoed against the metallic walls of the starship corridor like war drums. Admiral Rywenzul had returned to the vessel earlier than scheduled, and no one aboard the Astral Dominion had anticipated his arrival. His face still bore the marks of interstellar political battles fought in the high chambers of the Galactic Confederation. His eyes were weary from negotiating resource treaties, from outmaneuvering rival admirals, from building empires upon the cosmic dust of fallen civilizations. He desired nothing beyond silence, a glass of synthesized Arcturon wine, solitude. But what his crimson eyes captured in that moment froze him in place, as if the artificial gravity had suddenly intensified beneath his feet. Amelia, his human botanist, stood before an enormous holographic display. Her simple earth-toned uniform contrasted sharply with the intensity of her movements. Her hands danced through the projection with almost hypnotic grace, manipulating complex equations and formulas that seemed like secret codes from another dimension. And there, sitting cross-legged on the laboratory stool, was Torin, his 7-year-old son, gazing at her with an admiration that Ryven had never witnessed before. The boy's eyes gleamed as if he were witnessing a cosmic event unfold before him. Amelia wasn't tending to the hydroponic gardens, wasn't monitoring the atmospheric calibrations of the endless corridors of this cold starship. She wasn't polishing equipment that cost more than entire planetary settlements. She was teaching his son advanced quantum mechanics, mechanics that Ryven himself hadn't touched since his years at the Galactic Academy. For a brief and disturbing moment, he thought his neural implants must be malfunctioning. A human botanist teaching theoretical physics. Impossible. Absurd. But the holographic display didn't lie. The equations were real and her genius was too. Ryven remained motionless in the doorway, his mouth slightly agape, the recycled air caught in his lungs. The bioluminescent panels above pulsed softly, casting a blue-green light over this surreal scene that defied everything he believed he knew about his own world. Amelia hadn't noticed him. Her entire focus was on Torin, who scribbled furiously on his data tablet, absorbing every word like a black hole consuming light. "Now remember, Torin," she said with a firm yet nurturing voice. "Quantum physics isn't about memorizing formulas. It's about patterns. It's about understanding the language of the universe itself." The words struck Ryven like a photon blast to the chest. He couldn't recall the last time he had taught his son anything of significance. His universe had always revolved around fleet deployments, territorial expansions, resource indices, and quarterly reports to high command. The boy's world had been left in the care of educational androids, expensive tutors, and occasional holographic calls made between diplomatic missions. But there stood Amelia, the woman whose presence he barely acknowledged each cycle, giving his son something he never managed to provide: true inspiration, passion, life. Ryven's mind became a violent nebula of thoughts. Memories began flooding his consciousness like furious solar flares. How Amelia had entered his service cycles ago. Humble, quiet, hardworking, always respectful, never intrusive, always blending into the luxurious backdrop of the Admiral's quarters like another piece of imported Venusian furniture. To him, she was just another crew member, nothing beyond that. But now, watching her explain the complexities of quantum formulae with disconcerting ease, he realized something devastating. He had never truly seen her, never asked where she came from, what she knew, what dreams she carried hidden in her heart. Torin's childlike voice broke through his trance like lightning splitting the darkness. "Miss Amelia, does this mean I can solve problems that even adults can't figure out?" Amelia smiled slowly, her eyes warming the entire bay. "Yes, Torin, you're capable of far more than you imagine. All you need is curiosity and courage." Ryven felt a knot rising in his throat, choking him. That word haunted him like a ghost from the past. Courage. For years, he had constructed entire interstellar empires, but had been too cowardly to enter his own son's world. He always justified his absence as necessary to provide for their future. But there, in that moment, frozen in time, he finally understood. All his wealth and power could never purchase the devastating impact he was witnessing. His entire fleet was worthless compared to this. He wanted to leave, to retreat before anyone noticed his presence. But his feet refused to obey. His heart begged for answers he didn't know how to formulate. And then it happened. Amelia turned slightly and her eyes met his. The holographic stylus trembled between her fingers. She froze, her eyes widening with surprise and fear. "Admiral, I didn't expect you back so soon," she whispered, her voice faltering. Torin turned as well, his face lighting up with innocent joy. "Father, look, Miss Amelia is teaching me real physics. The physics of geniuses." Riven forced a smile, but his eyes remained fixed on Amelia, like tractor beams piercing through her soul. "What's happening here?" he asked, his voice calmer than the storm devastating his interior. Amelia lowered her gaze, all her confidence melting into pure nervousness. "I apologize, Admiral. I didn't mean to overstep boundaries. Torin was curious about the equations in my old notebook one day." "Your old notebook?" Riven interrupted, astonished. "Yes," Amelia swallowed hard. "I used to study astrophysics in my world, but life..." Her words dissolved into the air, her voice breaking like crystal. In that instant, the Admiral's world imploded. Amelia's story began unfolding in Riven's mind like pieces of a cosmic puzzle he had cowardly ignored for entire cycles. She wasn't just a botanist. She was a scholar, a dreamer, someone whose ambitions had been buried beneath the crushing weight of poverty, loss, and circumstances too cruel to imagine. And there she was, not complaining, not seeking pity, but pouring what little remained into his son's heart. That night, Riven couldn't sleep. The image of Torin's animated face and Amelia's angelic patience haunted him like a persistent phantom. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless, not because of failed missions, but because of a devastating realization. His vast power had blinded him to treasures that were right under his nose all along. The following days were disturbingly different. Riven began to observe in silence, hidden in the shadows, like a spy in his own starship. He watched Amelia teach his son with a mastery that defied any logic. She aligned each lesson with Torin's natural curiosity, mixing fascinating stories, powerful analogies, and genuine laughter into lessons that would seem terrifying to anyone else. And then Riven saw something that shattered him inside. Torin, that once lazy boy easily distracted by holographic games, now sat for hours on end with a focus sharper than Riven had ever witnessed. The boy's eyes shined with a flame he didn't know existed. But what truly pierced the Admiral's heart was discovering that Amelia taught more than just physics. She taught values disguised within the equations: patience, resilience, humility. When Torin failed to solve a problem, she never reprimanded him. Never. Instead, she would say with devastating tenderness, "Each mistake is proof that you're trying." Every great discovery in the universe was built upon thousands of errors. Riven's heart bled. He began to witness his son transform before his eyes, not just academically, but as a small being overflowing with hope, confidence, and empathy. And none of this was purchased with his obscene wealth. None of this came from his status or overwhelming authority. It all came from Amelia. Then one night, as Riven sat alone in the quiet corridor of his private quarters, Amelia finally confronted him. Her voice was hesitant but firm as steel. "Admiral, if you prefer, I can stop teaching him. I know it's not my place." But Riven interrupted, his voice shattering. "Amelia, you've given my son more than I ever could. Please don't stop." He paused, realizing the gravity of the words about to escape. "I want to know more about you. I need to understand why someone like you ended up here." Amelia's eyes widened in pure shock. Slowly, like one revealing old wounds, she told everything. She had been the best student from Earth, dreaming of becoming an astrophysicist to build ships and schools for underprivileged children. But tragedy struck when her father died, drowning the family in unpayable debts. She had no choice but to abandon her studies and seek work as a ship botanist in the outer colonies. Her story tore Riven's soul apart. For the first time in his life, he felt shame. Not for his power, but for his criminal blindness. He realized he had walked past greatness every day, too consumed by profit margins to notice the obvious. From that day forward, Riven made a decision that would change everything. He offered resources for Amelia to resume her studies, but to his absolute surprise, she refused. "Admiral, I appreciate it more than you can imagine," she said softly. "But now my greatest joy is helping Torin. If he can become the being he's destined to be, that's enough for me." Tears burned Riven's eyes. In that devastating moment, he saw what true wealth was. Not in the vaults of his accounts, not in his endless fleets, but in the heart of a woman who lost everything and still chose to give. Then all hell broke loose. One day, Riven received a transmission from his legal team. The news had leaked. Shareholders mocked him on the galactic networks, saying it was dangerous and shameful to let a human botanist influence the heir to his empire. "What will people think?" they growled through the quantum communicator. Council members, old allies, and even relatives harshly questioned his judgment. Sensationalist headlines exploded everywhere. Human botanist becomes tutor to galactic admiral. Heir's future at risk. The pressure became unbearable. Investors threatened to withdraw support. Journalists surrounded the starship like hungry predators. Even the director of Torin's educational facility called, politely suggesting he hire a qualified professional instead of relying on botanical help. Each word was a dagger, testing his resolution. But Riven had changed profoundly. Then, on a cold night by starship standards, he found Amelia alone in the hydroponics bay, hands intertwined, eyes red from crying. "Admiral, I received a transmission. My mother is very ill. I need to return home," she said, her words cutting through Riven like a sharpened blade. He finally understood how dependent his family had become on her. Not just for the lessons, but for the human warmth, the genuine kindness, the life she brought to this frozen starship. "I'll help you," Riven said with unshakable firmness. "Whatever is necessary, medical care, expenses, consider it done." Amelia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You've already done too much. I don't want charity. I just need to be there." Riven leaned in, his voice gentle but resolute. "This isn't charity, Amelia. It's gratitude. You've given my son and me something I can never repay." Within days, everything was arranged. Riven's personal shuttle took Amelia back to her home planet, carrying not just her, but doctors and supplies. He himself visited the settlement weeks later, shocked by the poverty but inspired by Amelia's silent determination to give back. He saw how children gathered around her, hungry to learn. It was then that Riven had the idea that would define his true legacy. A foundation dedicated to education in struggling colonies, with Amelia at its heart, not as a botanist, but as a director, visionary, mentor. When Amelia returned months later, Torin ran into her arms, tears flooding his face. "I thought you wouldn't come back." Amelia smiled through her own tears. "I promised I would never stop teaching you, remember?" Years passed. Torin grew brilliant and compassionate, carrying with him the lessons that Amelia instilled. And Riven, older and infinitely wiser, often thought of that day when he arrived early at the ship, the day that rewrote the entire equation of his life. The decades of traversing between star systems had left Riven hardened like neutronium. Once a bold tactical officer from the Outer Rim colonies, he had risen through the ranks of the Galactic Confederation through sheer determination and brilliance. His species, the Araxians, were known for their logical minds and unflinching dedication to duty. Their striking appearance, blue-gray skin, luminous crimson eyes, and imposing stature, made them natural leaders in the eyes of many galactic species. When Riven was appointed Admiral of the Astral Dominion, the flagship of the Confederation's 7th Fleet, many whispered it was merely his birthright. The Zul lineage had produced commanders for generations. Few understood the crushing pressure that came with such heritage, the expectation of perfection, the duty to expand, to conquer, to bring more systems under the banner of the Confederation. Riven's private quarters aboard the Dominion were a testament to his status. Expansive, adorned with artifacts from 100 worlds, cold in their perfection. He had specifically requested Earth specimens in his personal botanical bay, finding something oddly soothing about the primitive yet resilient plant life from that backwater world. That was how Amelia Wright had entered his orbit. A human botanist with exceptional knowledge of xenobotany, recommended by the science division after his previous caretaker had retired. Humans were still relatively new to the interstellar community. Earth had only joined the Confederation 67 years ago, and they remained a curiosity to many. Their adaptability and emotional intelligence had quickly earned them positions throughout the fleet. Though rarely in command roles, they were valued for their creativity and innovative thinking, qualities the more structured species sometimes lacked. Torin, Riven's son, was the product of a political marriage to another prominent Erisian family. The union had been dissolved by mutual agreement 5 years ago, with Riven receiving full custody as per their cultural traditions. At 7 years old, Torin was already being groomed for command, his education carefully structured to emphasize strategy, diplomacy, and the hard sciences. What he lacked in his curriculum, what Riven had never thought to include, was passion. The Botanical Bay was Torin's favorite place on the massive vessel. Riven had always assumed it was the exotic plants that drew the boy there, or perhaps the change from the sterile environment of the rest of the ship. He had never suspected it might be the human who tended them. As Riven stood frozen in the doorway that fateful day, watching Amelia guide his son through quantum mechanics that would challenge academy graduates, a terrible realization dawned on him. He had failed to see what was directly before him. Not just Amelia's intellect, but the connection she had formed with his son, a connection he himself had never managed to establish. The amplitude probability, Amelia was saying, her fingers manipulating the holographic display with practiced ease, tells us the likelihood of finding a particle in a specific state. But here's the fascinating part. Observation itself affects the outcome. Torin nodded eagerly. Like the double-slit experiment you showed me yesterday. Exactly. Amelia beamed at him. You're catching on faster than most of my university peers did. University peers. The phrase echoed in Riven's mind. Who was this woman really? When their eyes finally met across the room, Riven saw something he hadn't expected. Not just fear of reprimand, but a deep sadness, the kind that comes from buried dreams. In the days that followed their confrontation, Riven conducted his own investigation. He accessed Amelia's personnel file, discovering the gaps in her history. She had been enrolled at Earth's prestigious Cambridge Institute of Theoretical Physics, on track to become one of humanity's brightest minds in quantum mechanics. Then suddenly, she had dropped out in her final year. The file noted she had taken various positions: research assistant, lab technician, and finally botanical specialist aboard Confederation vessels. Why would someone with such promise abandon her path? The answer came during their second private conversation, held in his quarters while Torin was at his mandatory physical training. My father was a physicist, too, Amelia explained, her eyes fixed on the stars outside the viewport. He worked on the early human attempts at FTL travel. When the accident happened, she paused, gathering herself. The compensation wasn't enough. Medical bills, funeral costs, our home. She shook her head. My mother and sisters needed support. Botany had been a hobby, but it qualified me for immediate off-world work. The pay for Confederation service was enough to keep them afloat. But your studies, your future, Riven said. Sometimes we don't get to choose our path, Admiral, she said with a resigned smile. We follow the one that necessity carves for us. The injustice of it struck Riven like a physical blow. Here was a mind capable of advancing galactic understanding of quantum mechanics, reduced to monitoring hydroponics and atmospheric scrubbers because of financial need. In the vastness of the Confederation's resources, such waste seemed criminal. More disturbing still was how quickly he had categorized her upon their first meeting. Human botanist, service personnel. He had never looked deeper, never questioned why someone with her obvious intelligence was content with such a position. His own prejudices had blinded him, not just about humans, but about the rigid class structures he had always accepted as natural. Torin's transformation under Amelia's guidance was nothing short of miraculous. The boy who had mechanically completed his assignments with the minimum required effort now thrived intellectually. He asked questions, proposed theories, stayed up late reading scientific journals far beyond his assigned curriculum. "What did you do differently?" Riven asked Amelia one evening after observing a particularly animated lesson. She considered the question carefully. "I didn't treat knowledge as something to be downloaded into his brain. I showed him why it matters." She smiled. Children of any species need to understand the why before they care about the how. Such a simple insight, yet it had eluded the finest educational programmers in the Confederation. The scandal, when it broke, was inevitable. An anonymous source, likely someone from the educational division who had noticed Torin's sudden academic leap, had leaked information about the human botanist who was interfering with the heir's development. The Galactic Council, already skeptical of humans in positions of influence, demanded an explanation. Traditionalists among Riven's own species expressed outrage at the contamination of proper Arisian education. Even his former spouse sent a scathing communication, questioning his fitness as a father. For a being who had spent his entire life adhering to protocol and meeting expectations, the pressure should have been unbearable. Yet Riven found himself strangely unmoved by the criticism. For perhaps the first time in his life, he saw clearly what mattered and what did not. When Amelia received news of her mother's illness, Riven didn't hesitate. He assigned his personal medical team to accompany her home, equipped with technologies far beyond what was available in Earth's public health systems. He arranged indefinite paid leave, ensuring her position would remain secure. What he hadn't anticipated was how empty the ship would feel in her absence. "When will Miss Amelia return?" Torin asked daily, his studies once again becoming perfunctory and lifeless. "I don't know, son," Riven answered truthfully. The emptiness in the botanical bay seemed to have spread throughout the entire vessel. 3 weeks into her absence, Riven made a decision that shocked the Galactic Council and his senior officers alike. He requested temporary command reassignment, citing personal matters, and set course for Earth in his private vessel. The planet was as beautiful and chaotic as he remembered from his sole diplomatic visit decades earlier. Unlike most Confederation worlds with their carefully planned global cities and regulated environments, Earth remained a patchwork of development. Some regions boasted technology approaching Confederation standards, while others seemed trapped centuries behind. Amelia's hometown fell into the latter category, located in what humans called the developing world. It was a community struggling with basic infrastructure and limited resources. The settlement's lone medical facility was overwhelmed, chronically understaffed, and woefully under-equipped. Riven found Amelia not at her mother's bedside as he had expected, but in an improvised classroom at the edge of town. 24 children of varying ages sat in rapt attention as she explained principles of physics using nothing but sticks, stones, and hand-drawn diagrams. She faltered mid-sentence when she saw him in the doorway, an imposing Arisian commander in a place where few humans had ever seen an extraterrestrial being in person. The children turned as one, eyes widening, some in fear, others in wonder. "Admiral," she said, composing herself quickly. "This is unexpected." That evening, after the children had dispersed and Amelia had checked on her recovering mother, they sat beneath unfamiliar stars on the roof of her family's modest dwelling. "Why did you really come?" she asked. Riven considered the question carefully. In his 412 years of life, he had faced space battles, diplomatic crises, and the cold vacuum of space itself. Yet nothing had prepared him for the vulnerability of this moment. "I realized something," he said finally. "The Confederation spans 873 star systems. We have technologies that can restructure planets and harness the power of suns. Yet we've created a society where brilliant minds are wasted because of accidents of birth or circumstance." He looked at her directly. "I want to change that." The Amelia Wright Foundation for Interspecies Education was established formally 3 months later with funding directly from the Admiral's personal fortune. Its mission was revolutionary yet simple: to identify promising minds from underdeveloped regions across all Confederation worlds and provide them with the resources to reach their full potential. The Foundation's first campus was built near Amelia's hometown, employing local workers and incorporating Earth architecture with Confederation technology. Additional campuses followed on 17 other worlds, prioritizing regions with limited access to advanced education. When Riven finally returned to active duty aboard the Astral Dominion, he brought with him not just Amelia, now officially appointed as the Foundation's director and the ship's education specialist, but also a new understanding of leadership. True power, he had learned, wasn't measured in territory conquered or resources accumulated, but in potential unlocked. Torin thrived under the revised educational approach. By the age of 12, he had published research in Confederation scientific journals. By 15, he had designed modifications to the ship's quantum communication array that reduced transmission delay by 37%. Yet more impressive than his intellectual achievements was his compassion, a quality Riven had never thought to nurture. On Torin's 18th birthday, the traditional age for Araxians to declare their life's path, the crew gathered in anticipation. Most expected him to announce his intention to follow his father into command, as tradition dictated. Instead, Torin stood tall before the assembled officers and crew members. "I have decided to dedicate my life to education and scientific research," he declared, "to ensure that no brilliant mind goes undeveloped for lack of opportunity." A murmur rippled through the gathering. Riven felt many eyes turn toward him, gauging his reaction to this break from tradition. He stepped forward and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "I have never been prouder," he said, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. Later, in the privacy of the botanical bay that had started it all, Amelia found Riven contemplating a rare flowering specimen from Riel 7. "Are you truly at peace with his decision?" she asked. "Many expected you to be disappointed." Riven's crimson eyes reflected the bioluminescent blooms. Those many never understood what truly matters. He touched the delicate petals gently. "These flowers were considered worthless on their home world, decorative at best. Yet your research discovered compounds in them that can cure neural degradation in 17 species." He turned to face her. "Value isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes it must be nurtured to reveal itself. You taught me that, Amelia. You taught us both." His gaze drifted to where Torin was excitedly explaining his latest project to a group of junior officers. 20 years later, when Admiral Riven Zul finally retired from active service, the ceremony was attended by dignitaries from across the Confederation. His military achievements were numerous and significant, but the official citation focused on something else entirely: for revolutionary contributions to interspecies education and opportunity equalization across Confederation space. The true measure of his legacy, however, stood beside him. Not just Torin, now a renowned scientist and educator, but the thousands of graduates from Wright Foundation campuses who had gone on to transform their communities and worlds. "What will you do now?" a reporter asked as the ceremony concluded after such an illustrious career. Riven smiled, a gesture he had adopted from his years among humans. "I believe I'll teach. I still have much to learn." As the Astral Dominion prepared for departure under its new commander, Riven walked the familiar corridors one last time. In the botanical bay, now expanded into a full research facility, he paused before a commemorative plaque that had been installed on his order years ago. It bore a simple inscription in multiple languages. "Sometimes the greatest treasures lie hidden in plain sight. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers." He ran his fingers over the words, remembering the day he had stumbled upon Amelia teaching his son. Had it really been 43 years? The moment that had changed everything, not just for them, but for countless others throughout the galaxy. "Ready to go?" Amelia asked, appearing beside him. Though her hair had silvered and her face had lined with the quick passage of human years, her eyes still held the same spark that had illuminated complex equations for a young Arisian boy decades ago. "Yes," Riven said, taking her hand. A gesture that would have scandalized Confederation society in his youth, but now seemed as natural as breathing. "I believe we are." As they departed the ship that had been his home for so long, Riven reflected that the true journey, the one that mattered, had begun the moment he recognized the value of seeing beyond surface appearances and preconceptions. It was a lesson he hoped the Confederation would continue to learn, long after he was gone. For in the vast expanse of the cosmos, with its infinite diversity of life and thought, what greater wealth could there be than understanding?